So let's move on to another bookshelf, this time also focused on the history of physics. Let's start with one of the most interesting volumes in the shelf, the one to the right. This is an autobiography of Eugene Wigner, one of the foremost theoreticians of the 20th century. Now, Wigner was a part of the so-called Hungarian Martians, scientists who were known for their off-scale intelligence and achievements, and he was part of the same group that included John von Neumann, Leo Szilard, and Edward Teller. And this is a very interesting set of memoirs as told to a writer named Andrew Zanton. Wigner's style as a theorist was rather formal. He created almost single-handedly an application of mathematics to physics called group theory in the 20th centuries. In the 20th century, he wasn't the father of group theory, but he certainly did more than almost anyone to apply it to theoretical and nuclear and particle physics. And he was always a very formal theorist, and that kind of shows in his style. His style is rather formal. It's very precise, but that's why it's also very clear. There's a lot of praise for his friend and fellow Hungarian John von Neumann, who Wigner considered to be smarter than everyone else he had known, including Einstein. And certainly the awe and admiration that people felt for von Neumann was reflected in Wigner's thinking. There's one particularly interesting aspect of this book. If you look at the inscription on the front cover, it says M. Dirac. And, it's not possible to know for sure, but I would like to think that this book belonged to Mansi Dirac, who was effectively Wigner's sister and who was married to the famous physicist Paul Dirac. There's no way to know for sure, but it's a possibility. So Wigner's memoir is one that I would recommend. There's two other books that I also want to talk about, written by Jagdish Mehra, an Indian-born American physicist and historian of physics who was really very prolific in terms of what he wrote about. He seemed to know pretty much all the leading physicists of the 20th century personally. He had extensive conversations with everyone ranging from Einstein and Werner Heisenberg all the way to Richard Feynman. And in fact, that's the subject of this biography of Richard Feynman that he wrote called The Beat of a Different Drum, The Life and Science of Richard Feynman. And so, as I mentioned, Mehra actually knew Feynman extremely well. He had countless hours of conversation with him, and he talked to him very extensively about his life and work. Now, the only drawback, if you will, of this book is that Mehra's style is slightly pedagogical. So if you compare it to another well-known biography of Feynman, namely James Glick's biography titled Genius, Genius is definitely much more readable than Mehra's book. But Mehra's book is much more of a scientific biography. In fact, there are some fairly technical parts of the biography which can be easily skipped if you're not interested in the physics. But he certainly does the best job of any biographer of Feynman in detailing the science that Feynman produced. And that kind of makes it unique, even if it may not be exactly an exciting bedtime read, if you will. To the left, you see a very famous biography of Niels Bohr by Abraham Pais, who was a very well-known physicist in his own right. And Pais's book is very much worth reading. He talks about Bohr's work, not just in physics, but also as a statesman of science. He saw the need for international cooperation in getting rid of nuclear weapons more than perhaps anyone else of his time. And so Pais's book really treats all aspects of Bohr's life really well. There's a couple of other more general books on the history of physics. There's also a biography of Niels Bohr by a woman named Ruth Moore. This was written in the 60s, and it's really much more of a personal biography. It's not as much about the science, but it's about Niels Bohr as a person, and it's a pretty good biography. This book by William Cropper, it's called Great Physicists. It's one of the best books that I have seen which have capsule biographies of physicists. So if you actually open it, there's relatively short biographies of physicists, and there's some math. So this is about Willard Gibbs, for instance, and there's some math, but it's certainly not enough to scare away casual readers. In fact, if anything, casual readers get some pretty good insights into the actual science that these physicists did. And you can see that it covers a pretty wide range of physicists, all the way from Galileo through Curie and Heisenberg and Meitner, Chandrasekhar, certainly Newton and Maxwell and Einstein, all the way to Hawking and Feynman. So if you wanted to gift someone a sort of one-stop shop that would list brief biographies of all the major physicists, Cropper's book is an excellent pick. There's also another biography of by Jagdish Mehra here, the same guy who wrote the biography of Feynman. This one is a biography of Julian Schwinger. It's called Climbing the Mountain. Now, Schwinger was well known as Feynman's contemporary, although he was recognized as a child prodigy. He was very quickly recognized as one of the leading physicists of his generation at a very, very early age compared to Feynman. And this is, again, a scientific biography, but it's got a lot of really interesting biographical material as well, just personal biographical material. So that's definitely worth reading as well. Now, to the right of the Schwinger biography, you see a book that's pretty unique. It's the Los Alamos Primer, the first lectures on how to build an atomic bomb by Robert Serber. And there's an introduction by my friend Richard Rhodes. So Robert Serber was Oppenheimer's right-hand man, a very close friend and colleague of Oppenheimer. He was his postdoc, and then he was a research fellow with him at Berkeley. And then when Oppenheimer was recruited to become the head of the scientific director of the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos, he picked Serber to be his right-hand man there. And he gave Serber the job of initiating all the physicists who were just joining the project in the intricacies of the project. And so this was kind of like a crash course on what was then known about how to build a bomb. And so at the very beginning of the Manhattan Project, Serber made all these, gave all these lectures, and they were transcribed by another physicist named Ed Condon. And it's a very readable book. There's great commentary by Richard Rhodes that gives some really nice background on what the lectures were about. They were classified for a long time and were declassified, I believe, in the 70s. But it's a very nice introduction to the basic physics of nuclear weapons. So the Los Alamos Primer by Robert Serber. Also by Robert Serber is his autobiography. It's called Peace and War, Reminiscences of a Life on the Frontiers of Science. And it's a really underappreciated biography. I love it. And the reason I like it is because Serber was a very astute observer of the human condition. He was not particularly literary or eloquent, but that also made him a very, very clear and sort of unbiased observer of everything that was going on around him. So he has very sharp character portraits, for instance, of people like Edward Teller and, of course, Oppenheimer, who was his friend and boss. And kind of the entire account is spiced up with dry humor that gives it a pretty special touch. So Peace and War, not one of the more well-known autobiographies or biographies of a physicist, but certainly one that's well worth reading. And then there's two other books here. One is a book called Igniting the Light Elements by Anne Fitzpatrick, and it's basically about the development of the hydrogen bomb at Los Alamos between 1942 and 1952. Now, this material is covered really well in other volumes, but what distinguishes Fitzpatrick's volume is the fact that she had a security clearance, so she could actually look at classified material that may not have been accessible to other historians and then decide on its value and include it in her book. So it's kind of a unique book and a unique look into the development of the thermonuclear at Los Alamos. And finally, you can see that there's another book by Hans Bethe. It's basically a collection of interesting essays by Bethe on all kinds of topics, ranging from nuclear weapons to nuclear energy and nuclear reactors, arms control in general, and also a few profiles of fellow physicists like Freeman Dyson and Richard Feynman. And Bethe was one of the most wide-ranging physicists and minds of the 20th century. So we get some pretty unique perspectives on a lot of the most important applied as well as pure scientific developments in physics of the 20th century. So there you have it. It's a pretty interesting shelf filled with some interesting biographical and autobiographical material. So hopefully this will encourage you to maybe pick up a volume or two from here.